So this is the way you look at it. On the charts on the left, the pictures on the left show a good situation. What happens today? We have unproductive land. It's not taking any carbon out of the atmosphere. You're burning gasoline, and in the biofuel situation, you turn that unproductive land into now into productive land. You take carbon out of the atmosphere. You're still burning fuel. You're still having the same emissions from the car, but now you get a gain. What's the gain? It's that red line. I'm sorry, not red line, that green line right here, which is the additional carbon taken up by plants. So this is just another way of looking at that chart that we looked at before. It's the additional carbon taken up by plants. What happens when we use existing corn? Now, existing corn means it's going to be grown anyway. So, I'm sorry, oh, excuse me, I pressed the wrong button. So existing corn means that in today's situation, the corn's already taking carbon out of the atmosphere. You're burning gasoline. Now you turn it into ethanol. You burn the ethanol, but you don't have any more corn. There's no more corn taken out of the atmosphere. There's no more carbon. There is no direct gain. So the first error, I believe, in Bruce's analysis is that when you use existing crops, there is no direct gain at all. The analyses assume that this is all new, all additional. You can take 100% credit for it, but you've got it anyway. That doesn't mean there couldn't be a benefit, but they're all indirect. So there are three possible effects when you use existing crops. One is they're not replaced. The second is that farmers around the world boost their yields additionally, beyond what they would otherwise do on their existing cropland. And the third is they plow up new lands. By sheer math, there are only three possible effects. All of these effects are indirect effects that are spurred by market forces through higher prices. So let's explore them a little bit. If people eat less, or livestock become more efficient, or we eat less livestock, good thing, I agree. Where's the benefit? The answer is reduced respiration. Remember I said you guys were polluters? You're less polluting. We'll talk about whether this is a good thing on a world basis. The second possibility, a better thing, is that farmers boost their yields on existing land. And that means they take up more carbon. So it's not that the farmer in America whose particular corn goes to ethanol does anything. It's that by spurring higher prices, farmers all around the world boost their production, and there's an indirect benefit. But there's also an indirect cost, because if you use additional nitrogen fertilizer, you're going to get additional nitrous oxide, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. In Iowa, if you try to boost your corn production by using nitrogen fertilizer, that will cause more greenhouse gas emissions per unit of ethanol than land use change, according to our calculations. And then the last possibility is you have land use change. And we've already talked about that. So you get a gain because you're growing corn on additional land, but you have this loss, forest or grassland. The key point is it's all indirect. So if you're not calculating indirect effects, you cannot count any gain for the biofuel or a loss. The flaw is you're assuming you can take a credit for all that carbon in the corn, but it ain't additional, it's only indirect effects. Now the next question is, by the way, is this a good thing? So why is it that all these studies say don't use productive land? And the basic point is, if you're using productive land, you are displacing other carbon uptake, and you're not going to get much of a net gain and probably have a net loss. So what if you use a hectare of land? Hectare is 2.5 acres for corn ethanol. After you account for byproducts, you're only using like 0.6 of a hectare. And if you use the analyses that Bruce is in favor of, you get 3.5 tons of CO2 benefit per hectare per year by displacing fossil fuels. Even if you have cellulosic ethanol using that good farmland at very high yields, you get about 9 tons. What if you simply left that hectare alone and said, just leave it alone? It would probably come back as forest, and you'd get 7.5 to 20 tons. Not timing on anything, that's just per year. That's just what will happen. That's how much carbon is sequestered by the forest. If you chop down the forest, you're going to have even bigger losses per year. Grassland is more complicated. You lose a lot of carbon uptake, but a lot of grassland goes into food as well. So the main impact of converting grassland is a further indirect effect, as people then have to replace the food. This is the key point. If you use land to make biofuels, using that productive land for other things that give us carbon benefits. And those carbon benefits have greenhouse benefits, either directly through forest or indirectly by producing food, so we don't need to get our carbon elsewhere. Now, what about some of the other effects? Well, what about reducing food consumption? That's a greenhouse gas benefit. Some of it's perfectly benign. If that is benign. But 1 billion people in the world get about 20% too little food today. They live on less than $1 a day. They spend 60% or more of their incomes on food. They eat basic crops. When you increase crop prices, they get hungrier. So unfortunately, when you reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing food consumption, a disproportionate amount of that is going to come out in the worst possible way. Now, what about boosting additional yields? This is unfortunately, oh yeah, it is visible. A great thing to boost additional yields, and this is part of the point. Bruce is absolutely right that we have, even beyond a biofuel challenge, we have a food land challenge. All that deforestation that occurs today that contributes 20% of global warming gases, that is primarily land use expansion to feed a growing planet. And we have to feed 9 billion people by 2050. And many of them are going to eat more meat, whether we like it or not. And for a lot of them, it's a good thing. Everyone who has analyzed the question of whether we can do that without cutting down more forest has concluded that even if we do a spectacular job, we're going to have to cut down more forest. So when you add biofuel demand on top of that, you are essentially adding an additional source of demand that even if we do a fabulous job at boosting yields, which is really important, is going to mean more deforestation. How much? This becomes really obvious when you're talking about a fair amount of biofuels. So MIT has looked at what does the world's forest, natural forest, look like if by 2050 we get 15% or so of the world's energy from bioenergy. And these are the world's natural forests today, and these are the world's natural forests in 2050. To a large extent, the world's tropical forests disappear. Now, why is that? Every study that has looked at this has come, roughly speaking, to the same type of conclusion. Numbers change. Why? The cheapest place in the world to produce biomass is in the wet tropics. The land is cheap, it's wet, and there's a 365-day growing season. Every analyst who has looked at a world where we produce a meaningful amount of energy from bioenergy says we're going to end up eliminating most of the world's forests, tropical forests, natural ones. There was a paper in Science that says MIT was wildly optimistic, and that, in fact, bioenergy, if we continue on our path, it's hard to read here, would eliminate all of the world's forests. Basically, here are the world's unmanaged forests, and this is what happens. I can go into some more of the details of that. Obviously, that assumes that we kind of are really, really stupid. We keep doing the wrong things. So here, let me sum up by saying this. You have to calculate indirect land use change as part of overall land use change, both practically and to decide, are you getting a net gain? But we can get some net gain. The National Academy of Sciences concluded that if everything goes right, we can basically make 36 billion gallons of ethanol using waste products and potentially finding the world's most unproductive land and making that productive for biofuels. And that's where we should be going. If you don't calculate indirect land use change, instead it's open season on the world's natural rainforest for palm oil production unless businessmen are just extremely dim-witted. And they're not. Thank you.